Dr. Mahathir, thank you for making time for this and being part of Digital Narratives of Asia to share your personal leadership journey with us.
Yes, you're welcome.
Your political career has spanned more than 70 years, 22 years as Prime Minister. Do you remember the first day you stepped into office leading Malaysia as Prime Minister?
Yeah, vaguely I remember a feeling of trepidation because I was going to shoulder all the responsibilities of governing this country, and that is something very big for me. And my experience is usually more as a subordinate, working under other people. Now I am not working under anybody. I am on my own and I have to be responsible. That creates a little bit of fear that I might fail.
And so what drove you? I mean, fear can drive you into paralysis, or it can drive you into moving forward and stepping up to that role. What drove you?
Well, I have always believed in confronting problems and finding solutions to them. And in the past, for example, I used to be afraid of dogs, and then somebody told me that if you run away, the dog will chase you. So stop and face the dog and pretend that you're going to pick up a stone. And although I was frightened, I turned around, stopped, and did just that. And I find that if you confront, you are much more able to overcome.
What were some of the biggest fears at that point? I mean, stepping up, it's a big role, right? But there were clearly issues then that were heaviest.
Yeah.
What would that be?
At the time when I took over, the country's economy was not doing very well. And I knew I was going to face a lot of problems. And I wondered whether I could come up with ideas about how to overcome the economic downturn. But later on, I found that by studying the causes in depth, then I was able to find solution. But initially, of course, I was very scared that I might not be able to come up with good ideas.
And you pressed on, right? So after 22 years, when you stepped down, how different were you as a leader then, you know, compared to that first day where there was anxiety? Yeah.
Yes, I felt more confident, and I thought that others would have the same confidence because over 22 years I was faced with a lot of problems, and most of them I was able to solve. And I thought that other people would be just like me. They would be able to learn learn all about the problem and the causes, and then overcome them.
In that 22 years, there were a lot of issues. It wasn't always smooth sailing. What were probably one or two that stuck with you as really trying times?
Well, one of them was, of course, the currency crisis. Then there was a time when I was challenged by the other leaders in the party. They contested against me, and I had to accept the fact that I was dependent upon support of the members of the General Assembly. And well, of course, I was not certain whether I was going to win or not. But in the end, of course, I was able to win and remain as Prime Minister. But there are others also which are not so big. I had to face resignation by my deputy, and I had problem with trying to find a deputy who is able to handle matters.
People relations for a leader. I mean, often you find that leaders, when they come on strong, or brain isn't the only thing that keeps you going. You know, you need people. How have you developed that relationship with people and to get a team going, because it's not a one-man show?
Well, I was trained as a doctor, and I practiced medicine for 20 years before I became a minister in the government. During that 20 years, I learned how to interact with largely my patients and their relatives, and the problems faced by them. I had to learn to be sympathetic to what they are troubled with, and to help find a solution for their problems. And in politics, it is practically the same. People come with problems, or there are problems for the country. As far as people are concerned, I have to understand what is it that is troubling them, whether it is real or imagined, and recognizing the problems, I try to find solutions to them. So in the end, of course, if you help a person to overcome his problem, he's going to be very supportive of you.
And for yourself, sometimes there will be disappointments. You know, when people resign, for example, how do you overcome that? Do you feel betrayed? How do you overcome these feelings? It's human.
I was saddened by the acts of some of my colleagues, particularly the first Deputy Prime Minister, whom I knew even before we became members of the government. I thought that since he has won, he would work with me closely. But unfortunately, I think a lot of his subordinates influence him. The problem with what I call the lieutenants is that they want to push their boss up, so that when their boss goes up, they too would benefit. So they keep on pushing, I think, and I think he felt that I was in office too long, because previously the two prime ministers before me lasted only about 6 years or 5 years. So at the end of my 5 years as prime minister, my deputy felt that it's time that I step down and give it to him.
So this feeling of being misjudged almost, you know, or have your intentions misread, how do you overcome something like that?
Well, I had a job to do, and I felt that I need to implement things. It is one thing to be entrusted with authority, but you have to learn how to use the authority, and it takes time. And by the time I understood how to handle things, I felt that I need time to implement. If I need to stop, then I think lots of things will not be implemented, and I wouldn't know whether they are good or bad.
Okay, you mentioned the financial crisis, and that was something that you had to make a decision that wasn't popular. In fact, you went against the IMF, and you also you increased your government spending, and you pegged the ringgit to the US dollar, and Malaysia rose from that far quicker than your other ASEAN neighbors. What was your thinking at that point? I mean, what drove you to know that that's the right decision to go?
Well, it took me quite a long time, more than a year in fact. During that period, I had to learn about financing, about banking, because you cannot handle something you don't understand. And I even asked friends who were familiar with currency trading. I wanted to know how currency trading is done, how money moves around when they are traded. And once I understand how this process is carried out, this trade in currencies, then I realized that there are places where I can intervene and stop the currency trading. So it took me a long time before I discovered how to stop currency trading, because I believe it was currency trading that had depressed the value of the Malaysian ringgit.
So it was you being able to step back, you know, from a situation and say, look, I have to relearn, or I have to learn something new. Would that be a quality that you think leaders need to continually go through to learn and relearn? Yeah.
Leaders must understand the problem, the basis, the causes of the problem. If they don't understand the causes of the problem, they cannot solve the problem. So I had to, well, it took time, but I had even to read books on banking in order to understand how banks work. I had to ask bankers about banking and about currency trading, etc. So I was very conversant. By the time I made my decision, I was fully conversant of how currency is being traded. And once you know how it is being traded, then you can find ways of overcoming.
Societal leaders like yourself, have to be strong in a lot of ways. You have to make decisions that sometimes isn't popular or sometimes may offend others. What is the quality or the trait that leaders like yourself need to have to take such action?
Well, I think experience counts for a lot, and knowledge, direct knowledge. For example, I had visited many countries even before I became Prime Minister, and I noticed what other countries are doing, how they are developing, and in fact we even adopted a slogan, "Look East," because we thought that Japan would provide a good model, Korea would provide a good model. So we learn from them, and once we are knowledgeable about how things are done and how they can be made to contribute towards the development of country, then it is a matter of adopting their methods, but with modification to meet the situation in the country.
So for yourself, what would qualities, your personal qualities that you think are critical, maybe name me 3, that have seen you through your leadership years?
As I told you, I don't run away from problems. I confront problems, and I try to understand the problem. So that is what enabled me to face many crises during my time and overcome them, and at the same time, of course, remain popular enough to win 5 elections.
5 elections, that's really something. What kept you going? Was your family, how was your family like, in supporting you in your journey?
But actually my family has nothing to do with what I was doing. I don't even tell them. I don't even tell my wife when I was going to step down. I believe that my job cannot involve my family. I actually did not allow my children to be involved in politics at the time when I was Prime Minister, for fear of being accused of nepotism. So I was basically on my own, and if at all I have some friends who are knowledgeable about things, and I talk to them, discuss with them, and also I can have a debate within the cabinet. There were times when they rejected my solution, but that was fine. I think they gave their reasons for that, and I accepted their reasons. But I mean, you have a duty to have developed the country, and you have to take that not lightly. You have to take that as a big responsibility, because if you fail, then forever people will be condemning you. I don't want to fail. I want to leave some good things for people to remember.
Were there points where you felt tired? You were a doctor, you could have a comfortable career and a comfortable life. Were there ever points where you just felt, enough?
No, I can't really think when I felt it was enough. I actually enjoyed solving problems because I was trained as a doctor, and for a doctor, diagnosing the disease that the patient has is a challenge. And when you are able to identify the disease and prescribe the medicine or the surgery that is needed, you feel very satisfied. It is a kind of job satisfaction as a doctor and as a politician. Whenever I find a solution, it gives me a boost, it gives me a very strong, well, I feel actually happy.
Energized and rejuvenated for the next for the next step, right?
Yeah.
You said you try to keep your family out of politics. You know, you didn't allow them to have a career in politics. But your daughter, Marina, we interviewed her on our show as well, on our program, and she is highly respected, you know, for her work in the NGO and as a writer. What kind of a father were you like to Marina?
Well, Marina has her own mind. She doesn't always support me. She sometimes become very friendly with the opposition, with the NGOs which are critical of the government. I had no choice except to accept that that is her way of doing things. She's not subject to my influence or control. She does things on her own. So, well, if she is popular, good for her. But sometimes, of course, her popularity may be at my expense.
But as a dad, how did you raise her? Do you think it's possible to raise a leader?
But you know, I raised her in the usual Asian Malay way of raising children, to be obedient to the parents, etc., to have to understand values, good and bad. But there was one instance when she went to America to stay there for 3 months with a friend, an exchange student who came to live with us. And after coming back, she was completely changed, because in America she was exposed to American values, where you assert your personality. You are not under control of anybody, including your parents. So she became very independent after that, and as a result, of course, she did not always support me.
How do you deal with that as a dad?
Well, sometimes it's irritating. Sometimes I feel sad, but there's nothing I could do about it.
You come across as a very rational person. I mean, to me, and I love your analogy of a doctor, you know, and I really see how you see the parallels with your job as a politician. As a politician, you have helped bring Malaysia, you know, through many difficult periods. I'd like to widen that, your role as a leader, as a part of ASEAN, right? Because Malaysia has been strong in the first 5 member states of ASEAN as well. What do you see are the strengths, you know, and the weaknesses of ASEAN from the time you were part of it, you know, as a leader that was highly involved, and what it has become right now?
Well, in the first place, many people misunderstand ASEAN. ASEAN was not set up because of the need for economic cooperation. It is not the European Union, which is based on economic cooperation. ASEAN was set up to avoid conflicts and wars between ASEAN countries. We were having problems between Malaysia and Indonesia and the Philippines. So we thought that if we have a grouping where the leaders can meet, then they can avoid war but resolve problems around the table. So that was the basis for the formation of ASEAN. But at that time, leaders tend to stay in power for a longer time. We have people like Suharto, Kim Kuan Yew, and even myself. So we know each other very well. It's not a question of leader of a country, it's just friends who know each other. So it became much more easy for us to resolve problems between us. However, there were economic cooperation came later. When we see Europe having that kind of economic cooperation, we thought that why not ASEAN? and we thought that we could set up industries in each other's country owned by all the ASEAN countries. We identified heavy industries for each of the ASEAN, 5 ASEAN countries, excepting Singapore. But unfortunately, the countries, the ASEAN partners, did not invest in each other. So even though Malaysia set up a fertilizer plant in Malaysia, we should be owned partly by the other ASEAN countries. The other ASEAN countries did not come in. And from then on, economic cooperation becomes difficult to manage, difficult to come up with a good formula. Eventually, of course, we have the ASEAN Free Trade area, but that too is difficult because on the one hand we are competing with each other, on the other hand the level of development of the ASEAN countries is not the same. Some are very well undeveloped, and some are almost like Singapore, for example, is practically a developed country. So cooperation between countries that are of different levels of economic prosperity is quite difficult.
So the concept, of narrowing the development gap, that was something that came up during your time as well.
Yes.
Take us through the thinking for that, and how do you think that has worked or hampered development in the region?
Yeah, because we cannot compete with each other. It's not an equal competition among equals. We thought that the weaker nation should be given time, should be protected. So when we had the ASEAN Free Trade Area, we provide protection for the least developed country, so that the products of the developed country do not enter the market so easily, the market of the weaker countries easily. At the same time, we try to facilitate the development of the weaker countries by encouraging investments and also exposing them to ways of developing their country.
How do you think that has worked?
Politically, for example, we find that Myanmar was not being democratic. It was a military operated country ruled by the military junta. But we brought the military leaders to the other ASEAN countries to show that economy, democracy will not be bad for them. It will be good even for the junta. So because of that, I think eventually they decided that they should become democratic.
But ASEAN also has this maintained a non-intervention policy, right? A consensus before moving forward. Every nation every state runs the way it feels it should.
Yeah.
Do you think this is still relevant and still the way to go for ASEAN?
Yeah, we feel that there should be no interference in the internal affairs of a country, which is a very good principle. On the other hand, when we see something very wrong happening in that country, not to try to do something would be very bad. We have the case of Cambodia under Pol Pot, when this man was slaughtering 2 million of their people. The whole world just ignored them and allowed Pol Pot to tyrannize the whole country. I think in that situation, countries should interfere, should intervene and try to put a stop to excessive abuses of power that you see. So while we believe that there should be non-interference in the internal affairs of countries, but there must be a limit to that. You see the country killing its own people, depriving them of their rights and maybe arresting them, detaining them and all that. I think we should at least try to do something to stop that.
How was that handled at that time? I mean, you have this policy to say, let's not do that, let's not meddle in internal, yet from a human point of view, you need to, right? You can't see someone doing something and not step in. How did leaders like yourself navigate that situation?
Well, one of the countries that was undemocratic, ruled by a military junta, was Myanmar. So we decided that Myanmar should be a member of ASEAN, so that we can have some influence over Myanmar and its internal affairs. But we want to do it diplomatically. So what we did was to invite leaders of Myanmar to visit our countries, to show that a democracy is not something bad, it's something that will not cause them to lose their influence or their power over their country. All they need to do is to be much more popular. So in a very subtle and friendly way, we try to influence their thinking about the situation prevailing in their country and about how they can actually develop their country.
You talked about leaders previously, where all of you have been leaders, like say, for a longer period of time, so you become like friends. Right now, the situation is different. Changes are more constant, even in leadership. Would you see that as a challenge for ASEAN?
Yeah, that is a challenge. You see, when you get to know somebody closely, then it's easier to interact. But when you go to the next meeting and you meet a different face and you don't know what the person is like, it makes it a little bit more difficult for you to get along with the person. You need time to know him, to know his character, his likes and dislikes. So I think to that extent, ASEAN relationship between ASEAN countries today is a little bit more brittle, more prone to disagreement than before, when the leaders stayed in power for a longer time.
So speaking from experience, how should leaders today handle such brittle relationships? And given how quickly things move and the shortage of time, to develop a relationship. Speaking from experience, how should leaders move today?
Of course, most countries are worried if their leaders stay on for too long. So they tend to limit the period that the leader can stay in power. But the period should not be too short. Maybe it should not be one term, it should be at least 2 terms, so that he has enough time to learn about things, to handle things, to come up with policies and to implement the policies. So that is one thing that each country can do, lengthen the time. But at the same time, if the leader fails, then there must be means of shortening the period that he is in power, because sometimes leaders can do very bad things. So you find a need to shorten his period. So there must be provision in the constitution for the leader to be indicted or charged with whatever wrongs that he has done. That apart, I think leaders should develop personal relations. This is done by bilateral meetings. We have bilateral meetings with Indonesia largely and with other countries, so that on those occasions you really get to know, to interact with each other, and that will build up understanding and friendship.
So truly it is true, more dialogue and more conversations, and sometimes even if it's informal, right, to build that relationship. ASEAN goes into 50 years next year, celebrates its 50th anniversary. What is your hope for ASEAN moving forward?
Well, I think in terms of regional organization, ASEAN is perhaps the most successful. There have been other regional organizations, especially of developing countries, but they have not been able to attain much success. ASEAN's achievement, of course, is that we are not confronting each other. We are not at war with each other. We are able to meet regularly in a situation of stability and peace, and that is actually very good. So we have learned a lot about how to interact with our neighbors, and I think the ASEAN in the future could even be a kind of model for other countries. Certainly in the resolution of conflicts between nations, we are a model. For example, in the overlapping claims on land, for example, we have resolved that through peaceful means, no confrontation. In Malaysia with Indonesia, Malaysia with Singapore, Malaysia with Thailand, Malaysia with Brunei. All these claims and overlapping claims have been resolved through peaceful negotiation or through a court of law. I think that should be the way for most countries. So while ASEAN is not a very powerful grouping, yet its stability is something that it can be proud of and can contribute towards its being a great market with 600 million people, and also it would be a place where people should invest in because of the stability and the fact that we don't change policies radically within short periods.
So you don't think ASEAN needs to evolve or needs to change because times are changing?
Well, we should take into consideration the fact that the East is obviously overtaking and maybe going to be ahead of the West in many ways. So ASEAN will have to play a role in international affairs and provide, give its opinion, its views on international affairs. For example, when we have this Trans-Pacific partnership idea, ASEAN did not have a common stand. We have different ASEAN countries accepting or rejecting the TPPA. But I think there is a greater need for coordination between the ASEAN countries when handling international affairs.
So you're hopeful for ASEAN for the next 50 years and beyond?
It depends upon the leadership. You know, the performance of any country or any group of countries is very dependent upon the leaders that they have. So I do hope that the leaders of ASEAN in the future carry the principles, the understanding that led to the formation of ASEAN. That is to say, we must never ever have confrontation between us, and certainly not violent confrontation. Instead, we should use peaceful methods of solving conflicts between our nations, and also we should play a bigger role in international affairs.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahathir, for your time and for your insights here on Digital Narratives of Asia.
You're welcome.